First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. I'm going to steal a phrase from Magritte. This is not a Henry Moore. This is a work by Anish Kapoor, a very well-known British sculptor, but he was born in India, and his mother was an Iraqi Jew, and this work is in Chicago. The point I want to make is that Henry Moore left a legacy not only of sculptors becoming global superstars, but that sculpture became, largely through him, something which cities, countries, regions, towns around the world feel they need in order to give them status and credibility. You'd actually be forgiven for thinking this is by Henry Moore, because one of the things it shares with him is there is no real sense of rigid outline. There's no distinction between inside and outside, which is certainly something that Moore himself developed, and is monumental, which Moore developed. But what's different about it is its very, very polished, reflective stainless steel surface entirely swallows the city of Chicago around it. Around the corner at the Pushkin Museum, you have an exhibition of another British artist called William Blake, whose most famous line as a poet was, "You can reflect the universe in a grain of sand." And actually, Kapoor's sculpture, I think, is a very good example on a monumental scale of a grain of rice doing precisely that. The subject of my lecture is public sculpture, and the subject of what is public sculpture has been hugely debated in Britain. This is Trafalgar Square, the heart of what used to be what we British like to think was the greatest empire in the world. And it's where we used to put our generals and our admirals and the people we glorified and celebrated military victories in. And you can see Nelson, the victor of Waterloo, standing on his column in the centre. Well, we're not so sure anymore about military victories. And if we do celebrate military campaigns, we don't do it by celebrating generals and victors. We celebrate the glorious dead. But the sculpture I'm showing you here, and it is a sculpture, is by Anthony Gormley, another British superstar sculptor. And it shows an ordinary man standing on an enormous plinth. In 1860, when this plinth was built, it was left empty because nobody could think who to put on it. All around Trafalgar Square, there are buildings commemorating England's great, imperial exploits. Uganda, New Zealand, Canada, they all have their headquarters around the square. But Anthony Gormley decided, when he was invited to put something on the plinth, that sculpture, an object, was no longer something that we really could take seriously. So he invited people for 2 months in an online competition to submit ideas of what they want to do standing on a plinth for an hour. So for 24 hours a day, for 2 months, ordinary people stood around doing very, very ordinary things. You could call this the ultimate democratization of public sculpture, but an even more extreme example had happened 10 years before. I don't advise you to follow this, but a young British sculptor called Michael Landy hired a department store and decided that every single one of his belongings, and I mean everything, including his passport, his birth certificate, all his papers, every photograph, every picture that he owned, from Damien Hirst's to valuable things, every object of his was destroyed in public over 4 days, so that Michael at the end of the day had absolutely nothing. And it was a very amusing installation, but it's also the reduction of the question, what is public sculpture for? We didn't used to ask ourselves this question. When in the 19th century Queen Victoria reigned England, her statue was, I think, in at least 63 countries around the world, most of them ruled by Britain, during her lifetime. But we don't celebrate monarchs during their lifetime anymore. We only do it after they've died. This is the most recent example. This is the Queen's mother, and you can see on the right the Queen actually, and it's a pretty terrible sculpture too. And behind her is her husband, George VI. And why don't we celebrate living monarchs? Because we all know where statues of individuals tend to go. But one of the reasons for the discrediting of the glory of individuals is because ideologies rise and fall. And if we no longer feel comfortable about celebrating monarchy, military or political leaders, it's because our experience in the 20th century means that we question, and we have the ability to question the ideologies, the reigning elites, in a way that we could not do in the 19th century. I'm not going to argue that Henry Moore was the reason that we are much more intellectually questioning than we were in the 19th century. That's partly the result of universal education, travel, and the suffrage. But Henry Moore did one important thing, and that was to make it possible for us to have a form of public sculpture that is acceptable, that is neither royal, military, but is ultimately extremely human. Poor man, he was laboured with the title, the ideal representative of the human race at one stage. Difficult for anybody to live up to. But one of the reasons I think he probably deserved that title was he was a very particular type of man, and to know why that was, I want just to look at his roots. He came from a very particular part of England, the north of England, from Yorkshire, where men are supposed to be stronger, truer, greater, and more direct than anywhere else in Britain, and where the landscape is full of this sort of outcrop. His father was a miner. He was the 7th out of 8 children. And when he grew up, he was very aware of the underground life of his father, of the tunnelling, the excavation, the hewing of coal and the rocks around his father. And I think one of the great contributions of Moore, he recognised the importance of the individual within the family within society, and society within the context of the landscape. It's important to bear in mind that he served in the army for 2 years in the First World War, and he served in the trenches, some of the most foul, stinking, difficult tunnels outside of mining to be found anywhere. Out of the 2,000 men in his company, 52 survived, and he was gassed in the First World War and as a result was invalided out of the army. And when he left the army, he went to London and attended art school at the Royal College, and he really disliked the teaching. Well, he disliked the teaching of perfection, and he used to spend a lot of his time in the British Museum. And Anita has already talked about the influence of what he saw in the British Museum, which was work that came from outside mainstream Europe, not Greek, not Latin, not Roman. There was a huge interest from him in what was primitive. He wasn't alone. Picasso was also looking at primitive sculpture at the time. But what attracted Moore was something I think he also saw as a child. In English churches of the Saxon period, these very, very primitive sculptures, many of which still remain in Yorkshire churches, they expressed feeling and sentiment unmediated by fine craftsmanship, which sometimes Moore thought just got in the way. This was what the ideal of art schools wanted all their sculptors to be producing, and it's what he turned his back on. When he was in London after the First World War, what he began to see were new monuments to the dead of the First World War. This is the most famous one in Britain. It's in Whitehall. But it's not by a sculptor, and it's not by an artist, it's by an architect. And around Britain, copies of this or other examples of architect-designed monuments were being erected. And for Moore, they didn't really express the extraordinary the trauma, the pity, the grief of war. So where to look for examples that would inspire him? And as a young man, he met the sculptor Jacob Epstein. Epstein's parents had emigrated from Poland to New York, but Epstein had come back to Europe and settled in Britain, and he achieved a reputation as the most outrageous, provocative, and disgusting sculptor in Britain in the 20th century. And this is why. This sculpture, if you visit London, you can still see. It's in Kensington Gardens, just north of the Serpentine. I don't think anybody would find it provocative, disgusting, or outrageous today. They probably would walk straight past it and not know what it is. But in 1924, this caused the worst scandal in art in Britain. Very briefly, it was a commission to Epstein to commemorate a writer, W.H. Hudson, whom none of us read anymore. But he wrote a book called Rima about a young girl who was half girl, half bird. And so she's sort of a nature person. And the rhythms of nature, fertility, birth, pregnancy, death, are of course a part of it. And this is Rima. It was her nakedness, obviously, which those of the period shouldn't be seen in public. Moore went to visit Epstein. He was very impressed by him. He went into his bedroom where he found the largest collection of African and Negro sculptures in Britain. And he was always to say that it was Epstein who took the brickbats, the abuse of the British public for modern art, which allowed him to carry on underneath. You may not know the name of Epstein, but if you have ever visited Paris, I recommend that you visit the cemetery of Père Lachaise, because it was Epstein who sculpted the tomb to Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was one, again, of our, how can I put it, flagrantly scandalous writers, who was imprisoned and ruined for his love of men. But in 1914, when his monument by Epstein was unveiled, another huge outrage because the figure was naked, and a decent Frenchman adorned the naked genitals with a bronze fig leaf. Unfortunately, somebody subsequently removed it and handed it to Epstein as he was sitting in a cafe in Paris as a gift. So the legacy from Epstein to produce something unafraid, something that expressed primitive, natural rhythm. It's evident in these early works about the same time as Moore was meeting Epstein. But I don't know how many of you are students, but I have a particular thesis that I'm going to try on you. It's always said that Moore's influences come from Aztec, Mayan, Mesoamerican sculpture. Undoubtedly true. But there is another ingredient, and I'm going to propose to you that there was a very strong Russian influence as well, because in 1929 Henry Moore married a Russian woman, Irina Radetzky, and he always used to joke, but it probably wasn't a joke, that he only married her for her shoulders. Actually, it was a very stable marriage for the rest of both of their lives, but Irina was unquestionably an influence on the development of the female figure, which became one of the key components of Moore's work. And throughout the 1930s, he begins to experiment more bravely with the female figure. And you can see where she holds a hand up to her head like that. There's a space through the bit between the shoulder and her head. And he begins to develop this idea that that space itself is not actually space. It is a part of the way we experience ourselves. And gradually throughout this period, you begin to see the figures become much more opened up, that the whole architecture of the body is a development of this, but he's actually punctured right through the skeleton so that you can see through the other side, so that you have a sense of a body in 3 dimensions. Holes in art were not his invention. Hands up in Europe was doing something not dissimilar with abstract figures. But I talked earlier about his sense of belonging to Yorkshire. I think that these sculptures are also about the landscape that he is living in, so that there's a fusion, an integration between what is around us and what we ourselves are. Even the materials that he uses, this is wood, obviously, emphasize this idea of contour. And I don't want to be fanciful, but the idea that we're searching for something outside of ourselves, for something greater than ourselves, puncturing right through ourselves to something else. I mean, if I dare say it, even in Russia, you're experimenting with trying to get out of Earth to space. There was this great sense of trying to create something beyond ourselves, and I think these sculptures, they carry within them this sense of trying to integrate a person, a woman, with a bigger landscape around them. Of course, it became a great, like many experiments in modern art, it became a great source of national jokes, holes used as shoot-throughs in galleries. But I do think all great artists who are doing something new have to simply carry that risk and live through it. And just before the Second World War, he was commissioned, and this is my thesis about the influence on Russia, he was commissioned by another Russian immigrant to create a figure which I think really does show you that inside and outside are integrated and fused. And this is the figure he created for Chermayeff. This was the great house at Bentley Wood that Chermayeff commissioned the work for. And curiously enough, that figure looks strangely vigilant, but also at home, I think, in that modern landscape. It's the most sort of hollowed out, pierced sculpture of the period, and it was the work that helped him establish a reputation as the leading art sculptor of his generation. Politics helped, the war broke out, but just before war broke out, the sculpture was sent to New York to the World Fair, and because of the war, it got stuck there. And when Britain was trying extremely hard to bring America into the war, Moor's figure, which by this time was in New York in a museum, it became a symbol of democratic values in a time of chaos. My thesis about the Russian influence on Moor continues with another Russian émigré who influenced Moor. This is Lubetkin. I'm sure there's a PhD thesis in this. This is Lubetkin, another émigré architect and designer into Britain, who most famously designed the penguin pool in London Zoo. Lubetkin in the end couldn't quite manage to raise the money for the commission that he had given Moore, but I think the inspiration of these influences, modern influences from Europe, did encourage Moore to some of his best work. For all artists, of course, war made it impossible really for them to continue their work, or at least to make a living, because there were no materials they could use. So Moore took to drawing. London suffered the worst aerial bombardment of a terrible bombardment for 2 consecutive months. The German raids on Britain took place every single night in 1940. And Moore and his wife were attending a dinner party one night, and when they came out of the dinner party, their car had been destroyed, so they had to go home by underground. And Moore was absolutely astonished to see Londoners taking to these deep underground shelters, lying together, individuals, families, groups, people who didn't know one another, in extraordinary intimacy. And he even commented that he thought the train tunnels looked rather like some of his sculpture. So he took this theme when he was invited to become an official war artist. Britain had rather an imaginative scheme called the War Artists Commission, where artists were given the task of recording the British Army or the British response to war. It kept them alive and it kept them in a living. And Moore's image as a man who believed in human solidarity was absolutely confirmed by these wartime drawings. He was a lifelong socialist. He believed that the state should build for the future, for the common man, and to educate its people. He believed in families in both the narrow and the wider sense. And he became an emblem, really, for the socialist belief in a better future after the war. This is a made-up shot for a propaganda film made during the Second World War. But it was a hugely popular film that made him into this socialist hero of the people. And some of his drawings of small people are like larvae, like chrysalises, of people who are going to flourish, I think, when war is over. And after the war, when Britain did achieve victory, I suppose, of sorts, a socialist government was formed. And Moor's optimism, his belief in ordinary people, his ability to make sculptures out of subjects that might have been thought religious before, mother and child, but to make them secular and understandable to all of us, because all of us know what it is to be either a child or not, if not a mother, have had a mother. It meant that he became the leading sculptor of the post-war period. His humanity, his feeling for relationship, for dependence, was very much reinforced by the birth, very late in his life, of his daughter Mary. And the family groups, one of which is outside in the Kremlin gardens in this exhibition, and the mothers begin to proliferate. After the war, his great sculpture in New York was repatriated. He was selected to represent Britain at the Venice Biennale. But most importantly, in the spirit of education for everybody, his work began to appear in ordinary parks, gardens, and plazas. This is the three standing figures, or I suppose the three graces, in Battersea Park, London. Battersea was one of the areas most badly bombed during the Second World War, but since the 18th century had always been a pleasure garden for ordinary people. And it was hugely important to Moore that ordinary people had access to beautiful things. Britain was brought very low by the war. We might have won it, but we were impoverished and exhausted. And in 1951, in an expression called a tonic to the nation, Britain decided to launch the biggest festival to celebrate its re-emergence after the war that it could possibly do. It wasn't a military parade. It wasn't about industry particularly. It was a celebration of innovation on an enormous scale in South London. And Moore was largely to do with arts and culture, and Moore was commissioned to make a very important figure for this, which has recently been bought by a Russian, I see, at Christie's 2 weeks ago. Maybe it will be coming here to celebrate something else in Russia sometime soon. And again, I think what Moore felt he was doing in this particular work was, this is more open. You can really not see this without seeing the background as well. You have to have double vision. You have to see the figure and the landscape at the same time. You can't ignore or isolate one from the other. And it's also extremely difficult to do this, because the figure is so hollowed out. There's so much space in this particular figure that the structure could almost be weakened. There are other expressions of this in England. The great medieval cathedrals started out as heavy stone structures and ended up as enormous, huge, airy cathedrals with as much light, so you can't actually believe how the stone can stand up. And just to give you the context for the Festival of Britain, which took place in 1951, occasionally in Britain, probably every century, sometimes every half century, we go in for these huge celebrations. And the last one we had done was in 1851. So 1951 was the celebration of the centenary of the great exhibition. And the most famous building in Britain at the time was this building, made almost entirely of glass, now burnt down. But somehow Moore's work fits into this extraordinary development of innovation, something becoming lighter, more aerial, more able to breathe, as this building does, and I think the 1951 Festival of Britain piece does too. And Moore's figures and his families are important for another reason. I think one of the reasons that they so resonated with people around the world. And that's because after the Second World War, the idea of actually being able to construct a human became very difficult and problematic for artists. Everybody had seen the films of Belsen and Auschwitz. Holding on to any sort of belief in humanity was extremely difficult for artists. Just at the end of the Second World War, Francis Bacon makes an attempt, and all you get are grisly bits of human parts trying to reconstruct themselves. But more, and I think not at all because he was old-fashioned, because he had retained something profoundly human, managed to be to have this extraordinary public common touch, and to talk about things that really mattered to people in sculpture. Britain was building a lot of new towns for people who had been bombed out of their old homes. They were experiments in good living for ordinary people. Here he is at the opening of his family group in Harlow. And at the same time, he made the shocking move to many people of beginning to work in editions in bronze. He had made his reputation by believing in the expressive force of direct carving. But after the war, demand for his work became so enormous that he began to hire assistants, carvers, dealers to distribute his work in what actually would become an international operation. Inevitably, with proliferation and the increased scale of his work, there were predictable accusations that the spirit of his original spirit had been lost. But with a lot of artists, I think making that transition from a very private and personal discovery to working for the public good and the public space was something he had to handle with new materials, and in some ways is quite an imaginative outcome. And I think it is true to say that his greatest work belongs to his growing maturity, and in the Kremlin museums you have many marvellous examples from that period. His later work made him a very wealthy man. And one of his great legacies, besides his sculpture, is the establishment of his foundation. It was founded in order to protect his sculpture as one aspect of the foundation, but also to use his very considerable wealth to encourage and develop the work of other young sculptors. No foundation has done as much for the support and encouragement of young artists as the Henry Moore Foundation has done. And the foundation is also now in the home that Moore actually lived in, and it's able to show his work where he most wanted it, out in the open, but not really in a grand place, just in a park. And I think this is one of the great final public pieces. It's very much about what he saw out of his window, the sheep grazing in the fields, and yet it really isn't about sheep. It's about dependence and interdependence. It's about the relationship between two things. It's about closeness and tactility. It's sort of sexy, but it's not overt. And it has that sort of peaceful quality from, I think, the Old Testament, although he wasn't a particularly religious man, of where sheep may graze. Thank you all very much.